Equipment moving into D.C. Some veterans have voiced concerns about this massive event and politicizing the military. And that was before President Trump deployed Marines and the National Guard to Los Angeles to deal with protests of ICE raids happening there. A lot to discuss here. Joining us now is Dr. Carrie Lee. She's a senior fellow at the D.C.-based German Marshall Fund and a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for joining me today.
No, thank you so much for having me.
And also, I should mention, it's relevant to this conversation, recently a professor at the U.S. Army War College. So there are some real concerns about this parade that's scheduled for Saturday that go beyond the cost of it. What are the political implications of this parade, and what are you hearing on this?
Yeah, so I mean, as you mentioned in the introduction, right, this parade has always been somewhat controversial. Recent polling suggests that a full 70% of veterans were against holding a military parade, and strong kind of majorities of Americans are also extremely skeptical of this. Obviously, the political context has changed, though. I think the Army leaders leading up to this week were working very hard to try and make this about the Army's 250th birthday and a celebration of those who serve and 250 years of honorable service by those in the Army. With the events going on in Los Angeles, and it looks like Governor Abbott in Texas is also going to be mobilizing National Guard for the weekend, mass protests planned for Saturday. The political context has changed quite a bit, and it's really difficult it's going to be very difficult to separate the two when you have tanks and troops marching in Washington, D.C. and, National Guard and Marines in Los Angeles policing crowds or protecting federal buildings just sort of out and about in the streets of Los Angeles.
We had one report from ABC News that pointed out there are more troops in L.A. than we have in Iraq right now. What message does that send?
I think it sends the message that the president sees the military as a tool that he can use domestically. I have big concerns about this, particularly given the very broad nature of the executive order that was issued on Saturday night that is not geographically defined to Los Angeles, that reserves the right to deploy military forces anywhere there might be protests that could impede federal activity. That's pretty shockingly broad language. That one can imagine any number of scenarios where the president or the secretary of defense may then feel like they can deploy federal, either federalized National Guard against the wishes of the governor or deploy active duty forces to confront American citizens exercising First Amendment rights.
As you mentioned off the top, this celebration, this parade is to mark the 250th anniversary of the Army. How do veterans feel about it? Do they believe that the military is now being politicized?
So I can't speak for all veterans, obviously, but polling even before the events in LA, polling leading up to the parade suggested that a full 70% of veterans were against the parade, and only 18% of them supported it. So public opinion polling suggests that veterans are not a big fan of this parade. They don't see it as something that is reflective of their service, and potentially may want to keep Army birthday celebrations in the way that Army leaders initially conceived of them, which was kind of local, community-based, very much focused on outreach as the Army is just coming out of a big recruiting crisis.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next question. How, we often see the National Guard make headlines after, let's say, a natural disaster. How does President Trump's use of the Guard change the relationship with the American public?
I think it's really tricky because normally, if the National Guard is deployed, particularly over the last several years in response to kind of anti-police protests, they can be seen by the public as a neutral arbiter because they don't have that baggage associated with police-community relations when you get civil disturbance. The problem happens when the National Guard appears to be taking sides. And so when the president is deploying the National Guard in order to protect the very ICE agents that are creating the disruptions and that the protests are against, then the National Guard is by definition choosing sides in this. And that has the opportunity to really politicize the military in the view of the American public and really damage its relationship. I would also add, right, the National Guard, the California National Guard, are Californians who volunteered for service in their communities in order to do things like disaster relief and to serve their country overseas. They didn't join the National Guard really to police their fellow Angelenos.
So what do you believe is likely to be the next step in all of this? There's clearly a huge divide.
There is a huge partisan divide, of course. What's really interesting about the opinion polling coming out right now, in terms of kind of public opinion, suggests that there are also a lot of people who are undecided, who aren't necessarily sure what to make of this. Your Democrats are pretty sure and your Republicans are pretty sure, but there's a large percentage of kind of independents and leaners who are waiting and seeing. And I think if I'm going to look into my crystal ball, the thing that I'm most concerned about is the weaponization of the very broad language in that executive order. If the National Guard deployments stay contained to Los Angeles, I have faith and confidence in the professionalism of the California National Guard and the Marines out of Pendleton, that they're going to do their best to stay out of the way and be as kind of uncontroversial as possible. I think the challenge is when you see red state governors like Greg Abbott mobilizing National Guard preemptively in anticipation of the protests this weekend, or you get other administration officials who decide that they want to federalize the National Guard against the wishes of blue state governors in anticipation of protests or other things. That has the potential to really go sideways.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are making the contrast in how the National Guard was not used on January 6th and making that distinction. A lot more to discuss on this topic, and Saturday, I think, is just going to be the beginning of the conversation. We hope to have you back, Dr. Lee.
Thank you for having me.